Okay, welcome to another guide for Wildfrost by yours truly, Gabriel here. This time we're going to be talking about how to deal with the true ending, or shall we say the heart of Wildfrost, heart of the swarm or whatever it's called, heart of the storm, rather. Basically, the true ending boss battle. And I'll have chapter markers below, though I don't know if this is necessarily one that you typically would skip around on, honestly. And really what I've outlined here is just the strategy I've used maybe roughly on 95% of the time I face this battle. It seems to work. I only need to diverge very rarely from this overall strategy. So, this guide is going to be geared toward people that are struggling with beating that true ending, either just at all or with any consistency. If you're already beating it with consistency, you're probably not going to learn much here, but anyway, we'll get into it here. So let's break it down. What are we up against here? So it's always going to be formed like this. This top row might be on the bottom row, but it'll always be the 3 units in each row aligned. So you're going to have a row with the Frost Jailer in front, Frost Lancer behind, and the Frost Junker. And the other row will be a Frost Crusher in front, Bomber, Muncher. Now, it's a pretty unique fight, right? All the other fights in the game do not have this full board of very high health enemies, right? So this is going to be a fight where some things that work for other fights just don't really work here. And we're going to break all that down later, but let's just kind of get an inventory of everything that we're facing here, right? So we've got the 2 in the front are going to have 90 health. That's quite a lot of health, right? That's more than even like the first stage of the Frost Guardian, or even a leader or whatever you would fight at that point. And then the Frost Lancer and Frost Bomber are more in that range with the 60 health. And then even the backliners at 30 health are nothing to scoff at. Something to pay attention also is the counters, though. They're disjointed here for sure. You got Frost Jailer is unique with the 5 count. You can have both the Lancer and the Muncher at the 6 count. Worth noting that Lancer and Bomber do have the snow resistance, so they're not really able to shut down that way. Then the Junker and the Crusher are each attacking 2 on a 2 count, which is very fast, right? They are going to be something you really want to focus on. So, they're going to be your scaling threats. Frost Crusher more so, typically. If this thing gets any significant amount of attacks off, it's going to scale out of control pretty fast. And at 90 health, you're not going to be able to take it out that fast typically, so definitely one you want to keep an eye on is Frost Crusher. And Frost Junker can definitely be a pretty big threat in some runs, particularly if you have a lot of consumables, or if you're using a lot of chump blockers. Keep in mind, whenever a card dies, if a unit dies, that does count as a card being destroyed, so the Frost Junker will gain attack every time that happens, and he's attacking every 2 turns, so there's definitely some fights where Junker can get up to like 10 attack or more and become out of control pretty fast, even with a pretty good deck. Then you have your threats to your leader, which would be the Lancer and the Bomber. Typically, I'll get to it in a minute, but typically you're going to be putting your leader in the back to protect it. And the Lancer and the Bomber don't really care about that, right? Because they have Aimless and Barrage. Now, really, the way I play it, Lancer is going to be the main threat to your leader, but Frost Bomber can become a threat to your leader if you don't have anyone on the row facing them, right? And I'll get to the formation in a bit here, but this is just something to keep in mind, right? These are the units that pose the most actual threat to your leader, because they can bypass the units that you have in front and just start damaging them. And then kind of the 2 kind of unique things here. Frost Jailer is the main thing that kind of locks us down, right? Every other fight we're able to reposition our units, we're able to recall them, Frost Jailer prevents both of those, and he has pretty high health, so he is definitely the thing that makes this fight very hard for you, as, you know, just as general utility there. But then Frost Muncher, oddly enough, kind of helps you, I would say. I almost think of Frost Muncher similar to like one of those Shademancer cards where you summon an enemy unit, and it might be something like Leech that has attack, but overall it's like helping you. That's kind of Frost Muncher. Yeah, every 6 turns he'll do 4 damage. Big whoop, I say. Usually if you're paying attention, keyword paying attention, you can have him help you thin your deck out, and actually have him actually just sort of help you out in the fight. So he's not really a priority thing to kill. So just looking at all here, you got the Frost Jailer that's going to lock you down. You got the Lancer and the Bomber that are going to be your biggest threats to the leader, so you always need to keep an eye on them, keep an eye on their counters, have answers for them when they come, and you want to lock down the Crusher, you want to lock down the Junker if you can. Priority goes to the Crusher. And then Muncher we don't care about. Muncher's a good guy. So who do you snow? Well, here it's really just going to be Frost Crusher with the most priority. And then past that, I say Junker. Those are the two that are going to do the most overall damage to your board. But, and I don't really want to throw too much snow on the dudes that are snow resistance. That's not to say you don't do it from time to time. You do want to slow them down if you have to. And every now and then you can throw some snow. If you have a very nice plethora of snow, maybe you can throw some Jailer's way, but typically most of your snow should go to the Frost Crusher. And if you have any abundance, then it goes to Junker next, and past that I don't really care. It really just depends on the fight. But really the key part here is you have to be snowing Crusher. It's very important in this fight. Snowcake is such a great card specifically because of that. I mean, it's a great card in general, but just knowing that you can get 12 turns of Crusher and just not having to be worried about is a really big benefit. And if you have every now and then you get one of those rare runs where you just don't find any snow, and in that case you might want to just focus on killing the Crusher as fast as possible, because he's going to become out of control pretty quick. But, you know, on that note, who do I usually kill first? It's usually going to be the Jailer. You'll see on in a minute here, I typically want to set up my main floor against the Jailer, right? Because I don't really want something that has Barrage and 4 attack just sort of hitting my main floor all the time. I'd be much better off just setting up against a Jailer and killing him, because once the Jailer dies, I'm free to just do everything. Once I can reposition and recall everything, this fight becomes quite easy. I honestly think that once you kill the Jailer, the fight should typically be won at that point. It's really just, I look at this fight as, can I survive long enough to kill the Jailer? If so, I've won. Every now and then that might not be the case, but like 95% of the time that is the case. And then Crusher, you'd only want to set up against him if you absolutely just have to, right? Because like I said, the Bomber hitting your whole floor sucks. Like that's a lot of damage, 5 incoming to the whole floor. And then in some rare cases, if you can kill the Junker fast, you know, if you have Barrage or Aimless or some really big heavy hitting targeted spells, or maybe a Grabber, you know, something with Yank that can pull it forward every now and then. You know, if you have enough snow to lock the Crusher down, but you don't have enough extra snow to lock Junker down, and you have a deck that kind of just can't deal with not buffing this guy up, like maybe you are just relying on a bunch of chump blocking, for example, well, in that case you want to kill the Junker probably before you even kill the Jailer, so yanking him forward might be something in that instance. But I would say a good 9 times out of 10 just kill the Jailer first. That's who you really typically want to go at. And then how do we position against this, right? So like I said, I'm typically coming against the Jailer. This is the standard setup. So what we have here is, and I'll just bring these up. So typically I'm going to put my leader last. I want them to be the most protected. I want a main tank, but then also kind of a throwaway tank. Anything with beef will do. Bomb I use it as an example because typically I wouldn't obviously want bomb on my main floor, and since I can't reposition, it's a great one to just throw away against this floor. The reason I typically just have one extra unit here is I'm almost never taking the companion upgrade. It just doesn't make sense. Basically always take the bell upgrade and then the draw upgrade is kind of my standard operating procedure, or whatever you want to call it. And your main tank can also just be anything, really. Like, Barrysys is a nice one because it actually has some utility, but it can be anything with health, right? And then typically I'll have my damage dealer, something like Foxy, or maybe a Mini Mika or something like that in the middle here, so that eventually Jailer will hit and the Frost Junker may get a few hits in, and that tank will die, unless it's a really good tank and you have really good support for it. But you want that damage dealer to kill the Jailer. And I will say, another reason I like to typically put the damage dealer in front of the leader is there are some runs that are pretty... My recording decided to cut out there, but I think I was saying, like, sometimes you'll be able to kill the Jailer with your damage dealer, but the fight is like close enough that your damage dealer might die right about that point, and usually I can actually just win it with my leader at that point. So, but it depends, right? There are sometimes I do put the leader in front, especially if it's like a leader that summons something, like if they summon a B-pop on their countdown or something like that, you might want them in the middle there. But again, 9 times out of 10, this is what it's going to look like. Set up my main floor against the Jailer, tank, damage dealer, leader, throwaway unit. And then also, I did mention that the tank probably will die, and at that point it's also nice to still keep protecting your damage dealer and leader by then replacing it with like a clunker or summon, something like that. Or if for whatever reason you have another companion, sure, you can put that there too. And same goes for the other floor. You particularly don't want the barrage unit to strike your main floor, so make sure you at least have some sort of summon or clunker to replace this unit with. And this is in cases where the fight goes long, right? Sometimes it just goes long. So as far as like the particular units go, or the enemy units go, so Frost Crusher, this is going to be the biggest thing you want to lock down, right? Easiest way to do that is a Snow Cake. Snow Cake, I will almost always take it if I see it. I'll even take it over a crown in a shop if push comes to shove. It is that important to me. I can live without a crown, but a Snow Cake, I could really I need it, right? It's so good. Now, not everyone is going to have a Snow Cake, obviously, though, and then you kind of have to settle for what's given. Storm Globe, I've kind of talked about it before. In a vacuum, it's not necessarily that good of a card, but because snow is so important, you'll take what's offered, right? Like, if I don't have a Snow Cake, I don't have any other snow, I might as well take a Storm Globe, and a Storm Globe will be fine, right? It's 4 snow the first time you do it. That'll buy you a good amount of time. Even the 3 snow in the other play is acceptable. It will run out eventually, though, so if that's like your only snow, that's when you're going to have to start thinking about maybe skewing toward a more aggressive deck, right? The more snow you have, the more leeway you'd have to be defensive, and the more leeway you have to stall this fight out. And I put Blizzard Bottle here twice, just to signify, like, this is like basically in the situation where you're just not offered any snow at all, like no Snow Cake, no Storm Globe. In that case, I think a lot of times if you do get offered a Shademancer, that's the map event that allows you to copy a card, I do think it's in your benefit to duplicate your starting snow card. That could be a Snow Zuka, Blizzard Bottle, whatever, right? Snow Stick, if push comes to shove. I think it's worth it. There's probably other things that are more tempting to dupe, but if you have no snow, unless you really think you can finish this fight within a few rounds, I highly recommend that you dupe your snow card. And that's the same thing with ink. Obviously that only applies to the one clan, the Clunk Masters, but ink kind of just deals with this whole fight in general, honestly. But certainly for the Frost Crusher, if you're just inking it, it's not too threatening at just like a 2 countdown 2 attack. That's basically a grumble at that point. But in the same vein, if you don't have bank and you don't have snow, you might consider duping the Flask of Ink. That could be acceptable as well. And those are the main ways to deal with Crusher. I could have maybe also listed here just like really fast damage, but I didn't list it because I don't want to lead people down that path, because honestly, maybe in one of my last, in this recent streak of like nearly 30 I've had, of 30 in a row wins against the true ending here, I may have had to rush Crusher down once out of that 30 times. The rest I do just go for the snow or silence on them, because that's just the most efficient way to deal with it. It's really hard to rush down a 90 health unit with consistency. Then I got the Frost Lancer. This is the one that really, since we're going to be setting up against this floor, this is the guy that represents the threat to your leader. And, it's another reason, by the way, that I typically want a leader with 8 or more health, because I want to be able to, by default, survive a full hit from Lancer if I have to. Some fights you do end up having to pray to RNGesus that it doesn't hit you, but you want to try to hopefully build your deck such that you don't have to pray to RNGesus. And what are the ways to do that? Well, health buffs are great, right? All of the health buff card games in general are very good in this game. Pinkberry Juice is a premium card. All of the shell cards are premium, and a unit like Colonel is great. A unit like Shelby, on the other hand, is not. I'll get to that later, but, since you're not going to be killing anything in this fight for the relevant portion of it, anything with an on-kill effect you don't want, but, all of these health buffing cards are going to be great. If you can't get that, or just in addition to that, there's always ink, and ink here applies both to either the Lancer. You can ink Lancer so that he doesn't attack, it only attacks your front unit, because it loses the aimless, or you could ink the Jailer and just move your units around, right? Move your leader off of the floor. All of those are acceptable. I think inking the Jailer is definitely, or typically, a better call, just because you'll have several turns of being able to reposition your units, or even recall some of them. Frost is also an acceptable answer. Sometimes even lumining, like if you don't have any health, no ink, no nothing, and you have a weak leader, I would even consider lumin the Frost in some cases, lumin vasing it to double the effect. That way you can get 6 Frost to only do 1 damage, or you can get 4 Frost to only do 3 damage. And that's a pretty good deal. Definitely a viable way to keep his damage down. Or just kill the Jailer fast. This is a little more reasonable, I think, than... I did keep this one in here because typically, if I am going to use a Soulbound Skulls, for example, I will always use it on the Jailer. And just the fact that you can reposition your units really kind of hard counters this unit, in my opinion. And I put Mini Mika, that's just representing some really fast, hard scaling unit. I think it's more viable to rush down Jailer than it is to rush down the Crusher, typically because Crusher is much more easy to deal with. Plus, rushing down the Crusher kind of implies, unless you're doing it with specifically a Soulbound Skulls, it kind of implies that you're setting up your main board against that floor, which is just a bad idea since it's going into the barrage. Even if you rush down the Crusher, then you got to deal with the barrage unit. So typically I say just it is viable sometimes to rush the Jailer down because you're kind of incentivized to set up against that floor. But yeah, that's Lancer. He's probably the second most threatening unit, I would say, in what he does. And then Junker, your priority on needing to deal with this really actually kind of depends on the third point here. Limit destruction, right? Destruction of cards. So I use Dragon Pepper and Jun Mask as examples, but there's a lot of examples we could use here. Basically, I use Dragon Pepper as an example because it's a consumable that I don't think is super necessary to add to a lot of decks. It's like a nice to have. So you may want to think twice about filling your deck with cards like that. Sometimes you do though, but even if you fill your card with a few decks, or your deck with a few cards like that, you may not want to play them in the fight if you can help it. If they're not doing something massive for you, I probably just wouldn't play them, because you don't want to give Junker free attacks just for the hell of it. You know, you really want to try to keep them under control. But if you can't, sometimes you can't, right? Sometimes you do just need to play a bunch of consumable cards for your build to work. Sometimes you need to make a lot of chump blocking to survive. In those cases, you're going to want to focus on actually dealing with Junker by either locking it down with Snow or Ink. I could also probably say Grabber or Yank here, because you could bring it forward, and 30 health is not that hard to deal with compared to 90 health, right? So rushing it down could be acceptable in that case. But really, I do think you want to keep an eye on this guy. Don't underestimate how much damage this guy can do. I find even especially with Shademancers, you know, you might have a card like, I find that the card that summons a copy of the enemy unit is not too great in this battle. Shade Whisper, whatever it's called. And if you're using that to like chump block, it can definitely add up stats fast to this Junker. So really think about, do I need to chump block? Do I need to consume? If not, let's try not to do it, right? Then the Frost Bomber. Like I said, you really don't want this guy to hit your main floor. Usually I'm able to maneuver the fight such that it just doesn't happen, right? And the best way to do that is to have fodder. You know, you start with that throwaway unit that we talked about, something like a bomb. It could be a spike, just anything you don't care that much about at this point, but has enough health to like survive a 5 damage attack, is a great candidate, right? But really past that, you can refill it with anything, like any of these clunkers that have several scrap are great candidates. Fallon Mask is great because it can survive a hit and die, and you just keep resummoning it. Ink can work, and again, that both applies to just inking the Jailer to like move stuff around, or you can ink Bomber and just have it only hit the front unit. Frost also works just the same as Lancer. You know, just get its attack down, then it's not too bad. And then also kill Jailer fast. Same type of deal. If you kill the Jailer fast, Bomber really isn't much of an issue anymore, because you can reposition your stuff at will, bring it in and out of combat, etc., etc. And then I've kind of touched on this, but these are the things you typically want to avoid. These are the things, in my opinion, that this fight kind of shuts down. So now I underlined the word relying on here, because it's not like these units aren't doing stuff for you in the entire sort of course of the game up until now. So like a Big Berry, for example, I wouldn't say like avoid using Big Berry, because Big Berry is a great unit all the way up until the final fight. And in the final fight, even though you're never going to get the on-kill effect, at least it's a 10-5. But there's other units like Shelly. I always call it Shelby for some reason, but Shelly, not really that useful at all in the final fight, right? Like a 4 health, 1 attack unit, and it's just not going to do anything for you. So really think twice about adding especially something like Shelly to your deck, because you got to understand it's really going to do absolutely nothing for you in the final fight, whereas at least a Big Berry can serve that role of being your frontline tank or the throwaway floor tank. Big Berry is a much better thing, but also I say, avoid relying on this, because on the actual on-kill effect, because you don't want to get overconfident, right? In all the fights leading up until then, Big Berry probably healed your floor a lot. I'd really try to pay attention to how much you've relied on that to get by, because you're not going to have that in the final fight, right? So try to make sure you have, don't overestimate your defensive capabilities, I guess, in that case, because you're not going to get those heals in that fight, right? And same with like an alloy, you know, you're not going to get any kills with alloy. You're also not going to be able to recall alloy to get rid of that bomb. That's, of course, unless you get the ink, right? If you get the ink, then you're going to be fine. I mean, you have ink by default, but if you don't have like a bank, it might be tough to find space to ink the jailer or something. And then also like relying on recall and repositioning. You know, a unit like Blunky, I find really suffers in the final fight because they can be a really good chump blocker in other fights because you can just block any amount of damage, recall it, and bring it back. But obviously you can't do that in the final fight, right? Same with Alloy. I think we talked about recalling and positioning already with her. And also that's why I don't really like cards like Demon Heart. I think they really rely on being able to recall a unit. Summon on enemy side, I think all of these cards are pretty much useless in the final fight because, as we stated, you know, there's no space on the enemy side, and by the time you kill your first unit, which is typically going to be the jailer, then the fight is already won anyway. So you had these cards that were just sort of sitting in your deck, hurting your draws all the way up until then, and then you can finally play them once the fight is already over, right? It's just, they're really horrible for the final fight. I pretty much never add these cards at all anymore. I'm on my 30 win streak, the only time I added them, which was maybe like once or twice, I completely regretted adding them. They were absolutely useless. I don't even think they're that good outside the fights personally, but that's, you can go back to the tier list if you want my in-depth thoughts on that. And the other thing is the low HP leaders. I kind of touched on this before, but I typically want an 8 health or more leader. The more health, the better. I almost don't even care what the leader does most of the time, as long as it has health. But these leaders that have, you know, 7 or below health are a huge liability because, you know, I still need to basically set up against the jailer with them, but now they're susceptible to Frost Lancer, and you're really at the will of what the run gives you at that point. You know, you need to find like a palm or a pinkberry juice or some frost or some shell, you know, etc., etc. You need to find these defensive options, but if they're not offered, you're in a real rough spot then. I would say if you get a really unfortunate set of leaders that are all 7 health or below, I would default to the Clunk Masters in that case, because at least you'll have ink there, and the ink can give you the chance to ink the jailer or ink Lancer and get out of a tough spot. That would be my advice there if you low roll on the leaders. And then just kind of in summary, this is everything we've gone over, but if you follow these main tips, you know, you don't necessarily need everything, but these main tips, I think you're going to do fine. So lock down the Crusher. That's the first most important thing. Snowcake if possible, Ether Snow if not. And then lock down or limit the scaling on the Junker as well. You just cannot underestimate how much that Junker can do. And as I said, don't needlessly destroy cards. Kill the jailer and the fight will become easy. Like I said before, I think when you kill the jailer, the fight is essentially over at that point. It really should be, unless you've taken massive casualties and you're down to like just your leader. But honestly, even then, I can still win usually. If I've killed the jailer, especially if I've killed another unit on top of that, I can usually win even if I've been whittled down to just my leader. And speaking of that, protect your leader. You know, the fight, you'd be surprised at how dire the situation can seem in this fight and how you can still pull through it. If you go back to some of my earlier runs, you'll see a few instances of that where it just seemed like there was no way I was going to win, and sure enough, I found a way to pull it out. But yeah, you got to protect that leader, especially you don't want to get just accidentally one-shot from the bomber or the lancer. So keep that bomber floor filled with summons and whatnot, just throw away fodder, and keep the lancer locked down with Frostbloom, or keep your units refilled with some defensive buffs. And that is going to do it. Hopefully that's helpful. Let me know if, if you end up using the tips and if they're actually helpful or not. This is how I do things. It's not necessarily the de facto way to do it, but this is how I do it, and it's been working for me pretty much every time. So, as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.